Welcome to this edition of the MDM podcast. I'm Tom Gale. Our podcast today is about artificial intelligence and its real-world applications for distribution. For the past 6 months, our team at MDM has been conducting research across wholesale distribution sectors that we are releasing in our report this week in September 2023. You can find a link to download Getting Started with AI, a playbook for distributor success at mdm.com, or enter AI research on our website. As artificial intelligence proliferates through every aspect of our economy, distribution executives are seeking opportunities to deploy these new capabilities. An abundance of AI-related resources released seemingly by the minute. At MDM, we heard from executives that most of these resources fail to answer critical questions about getting started and making AI practical. MDM research reports that distributors have been slow to adopt AI. Of our survey respondents in mid-2023, nearly 2/3 of distributors stated that they have yet to apply AI to any part of their business. 25% have applied AI in a single use case, and only 14% have leveraged AI in more than one area. In response, we sought to help distributors act on AI more confidently. Our research approach included in-depth interviews with AI experts and distribution executives, seeking answers to questions like, where do I start with AI in my distribution business? Which opportunities are most ripe for AI? And how can I foster the conditions for AI success? And because distribution sectors are still early in the adoption of AI, we engaged with 4 research sponsors who have been leading their own research and product development to incorporate AI into distribution-specific solutions and offerings across this industry. These 4 sponsors, NTT Data, Profit Optics, Proton.ai, and Verison, bring valuable perspectives into the challenges and opportunities distributors face today in advancing their ability to leverage AI in the most practical and advantageous ways. Our findings inform a new framework to help distributors use AI to deliver value in practical, tangible ways. And as you'll hear, this MDM report will give assessment tools and a playbook to evaluate how your organization can implement AI successfully. Ultimately, the distributors most successful with AI won't be those pursuing science fiction-like scenarios. Instead, AI value creation will belong to distributors who can organize around strategic priorities, execute AI initiatives from prototype to scale, develop AI skills, and build, with partners, robust data infrastructure. Within each of these areas, we discovered behaviors and a set of key decisions distributors must make along their AI journey, which we introduce in this report. One key insight was that the nature of questions executives are asking about AI has shifted from why to how. In other words, distributors are increasingly convinced AI can be impactful, but they've yet to put it to use. An explosion of vendors, applications, tools, and consultancies means AI is more accessible than ever. However, using AI to create strategic value can still be daunting. We heard and synthesized the common behaviors distributors are modeling to cut through the AI hype, instigate action, and maximize benefits. Joining me to share the highlights of the report is Kevin Reid-Morris, who we partnered with to lead this important industry research. Kevin, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. I'm really excited for today's conversation.
Give us a little bit of background and tell us who you are.
Tom, I'm a 15-year consultant that's basically spent my career focused on helping companies innovate, to think about growth strategy, to build resilience, and to lean into trends and big drivers of change as opportunities, not just threats. And I've done that from a couple of perspectives. So one is working for a manufacturer and distributor of building products. That was in the early part of my career. I then spent several years at Deloitte and helped start and grow their innovation consultancy called Doblin, and then spent a couple of years leading the corporate research arm of one of North America's largest design and innovation universities. And I'm currently running an independent consulting firm that takes on research projects like the one we're going to talk about today that really helps companies get more comfortable with new, whether that's new technology, new business models, new innovations. And so I've had a lot of fun over the last couple of months talking to distributors, particularly about AI, and excited to dive in today to that.
You structured the report across 5 behaviors. Can you just give a little bit of an outline around what that looks like and why you took that approach to structuring it in that way?
Yeah, really what I started to hear from sponsors, experts, and distributors was that making AI successful and operationalizing AI in companies really has to do with a bit of a discipline or an approach to making sure that you can get value out of it for your specific business. And those things, to me, actually started to look more like leadership action and behaviors than they did operationalizing the technology. First example for me, loud and clear, I started to hear that if you really want to make AI work for your business, the best thing to do is actually not talk about AI. It's to look at the strategic roadmap you have in place for the company, the big milestones you have over the next horizon. And that could be as big as wanting to IPO or sell or grow into a new market. And then working backwards to say, well, how can AI help accelerate or improve those strategic outcomes we're aiming for? And so that was, for example, the first big behavior for us, which was setting strategic AI priorities, which became so important because we hear so much about shiny object syndrome. We're seeing all these new AI use cases pop up, and we're very quick to chase them and go, oh, that's cool. That's novel. That's shiny. But really, these things have to make sense for the strategic direction of your company. So that was one of the behaviors that came out. It was a very clear pattern. The second one was about organizing around AI as initiatives or programs. And really, the bottom line there is, as a business, to fund AI initiatives like the real strategic initiatives, because they should be, to assign leadership accountability to those projects, and to make sure that we're assigning metrics, leading and lagging, so that we're actually driving indicators that matter to the business through what we're doing with AI. So that was a second group of behaviors. The third one was a really interesting pattern in what's worked for distributors in terms of their process of going from idea for AI through to scaling it through the organization. And so that behavior is really about building more and better muscles for starting small with prototypes, with pilots, with low investment, low risk initiatives that, once validated, can scale through the organization. What's really interesting about that for AI, as we learned, is that oftentimes scaling, which is the advantage of AI in its ability to self-learn, to trickle itself across an organization. And so if you can validate some of your early hypotheses, the scaling part actually becomes massively impactful. I'm happy to talk about that in more detail as well. The fourth big behavior was how distributors are thinking about AI and the implications for people. And so there's sort of two components to that. One is skills and talent to be able to work with AI, develop AI, lead AI, and then also manage in an AI-rich world, because so much of how we work and therefore how we reward people, manage people, staff teams is changing. And then the final one is building your AI platform. And that means looking at the data you have as a business and starting to think about all of the other pieces you need to add to that, whether it's through collaborating with customers or suppliers, or also going and finding partners and vendors that can plug in data gaps or bring to you new capabilities or assets that make your AI that much more valuable.
What's the differences that you found as you got into this in terms of approaching an AI initiatives versus maybe an e-commerce project?
I think it's a great question. So, and I'll answer that in two parts, I think. The first part is, this is really a recipe for introducing something new to the company, much like a lot of those technologies. And that's not by accident. The reality is that this is a new emerging technology that has the potential to be transformational in your organization, and therefore actually should be thought about with a level of rigor and some systematic decision-making for how to make it work best for your company and your strategy. So that's actually quite on purpose. That's particularly important, I think, with the massive and fast rise in AI today, because it's so likely to be caught up with the latest use case or this shiny object syndrome, and to rush to something that we may actually benefit from thinking about in a much more integrated way with the business or where we want to go. And so we thought it was really important to sort of lay out this roadmap that really is a roadmap for change of any technology, but show some of the specific examples to AI. There are a couple of distinct differences, though, with AI that I think are really interesting for distributors. And one of them I alluded to earlier, but it's this notion of how AI behaves at scale. And this is the big fundamental difference. So really interesting insight for us in the research was that a lot of distributors starting out with AI, particularly because they haven't had a roadmap like this potentially to follow or to think about the discipline of doing so, have reported to us that they found it to be harder, take longer, be more expensive than they originally estimated just to get to the starting line. So to get from initial idea for AI chatbot recommendations, for example, to get it out into the world and working with customers. That was more painful than folks expected. Why was that more painful? Well, they realized they had so much work to do behind the scenes to get data scrubbed and cleaned and ready for AI to actually use and turn into insights. They realized they had to upskill their people to use AI and now think about AI as a colleague, for example. And so that was really interesting to us. But here's where that gets massively interesting, at least in my eyes. They also reported that after they got to that point, the starting line, the work involved to scale that application through the organization was actually much faster, much easier, much less costly than they expected for the scaling.
Interesting.
And that, I think, is one of the fundamental, most powerful things about AI, and particularly how it's going to affect distributors whose business really is about mass, large numbers of products, large numbers of customers and markets. And so this ability to scale is interesting. So what do you do with that? I mean, what does that insight mean for a distributor? Well, one is, I think you have to get started now, because that whole idea of it being harder than you think, of underestimating the effort to get there, it really means that you have to start. But you can start small. You can start with one-off use cases that do make sense in sandbox environments to pilot and validate and then get to scale. But that notion that the sooner you get to scale, the sooner you're going to build advantage, competitive distinction, better customer experience, lower cost to acquire or serve customers, that is really powerful. And so if I was a distributor today taking away insights from the research, I think that would be one of the big ones, and why this framework is so important for AI specifically.
One of our main objectives around this research was to demystify this whole hype cycle that we're in around AI and really give some grounded insights and practical examples of what distributors are doing with it today. And along those lines, we asked you to include some assessment tools in here, and specifically how to put the research to use. Can you talk a little bit about that angle?
The building blocks and these behaviors that we identified in the research, Tom, we really didn't invent anything new here. This is just, I think, good synthesis of what we were seeing that was working and leading to success for distributors. What we did do, though, in bringing those things together is say, well, look, if you could look at these building blocks and look at these behaviors as a sort of checklist, a way to benchmark our readiness and our sophistication in terms of how we're pursuing AI, we might be able to help drive some strategic conversations with ownership and leadership groups of distribution businesses to improve their AI efforts and get started with AI faster and with more confidence, which I think is a great outcome for this conversation we're trying to start for the industry. Yeah. And so the assessment really took the behaviors and the building blocks, breaks them down into a really simple and easy to understand set of questions that you can ask yourself as a leadership team about your organization, and allows you to score yourself on each of those elements to ultimately come out with a sort of average maturity of those behaviors and building blocks for your company. And that's really helpful to hone in on where you may have work to do, or even what your superpower building blocks may be that are already in place to help dial in and ultimately improve your AI success. I have a long shot hypothesis that if we took that assessment and we sort of independently audited the publicly listed distributors today and found a correlation between the building blocks they have in place that we identified in the research in their growth over, let's say, the next 5 to 10 years, as we think about where AI is going for the industry, I think you would see a connection between growth and value creation and how those building blocks are maturing in those companies, just because of the substantial value that AI can create. And so if we think about these things as leading indicators to value creation through AI, I would not be surprised if that's the result. And we may want to talk after this podcast, Tom, about turning that into a long-term research project of sorts.
No question. This is going to be around for quite a while. As you were going through this process and your interviews and research, what did you hear that surprised you?
I went into this research, which really started as an open-ended exploration process to figure out what the current state is and trajectory of AI distributors. And I very much expected to be learning a lot about technology going into this. I'm not a technologist myself. I consider myself a strategist and designer. And so I thought, whoa, I'm going to have a steep learning curve here in terms of the lines of code that are being laid across the country in distributors as they make AI work. And it didn't take long into the conversations with sponsors, AI experts, and distributors to realize that the technology is really only one part of making AI work. And the biggest pattern that I started to see was that the indicators of AI success are much less about the lines of code and much more about the behaviors and tactics being put in place in companies to make sure that they can leverage the technology. So those behaviors ultimately ended up becoming the focus of the research as they were crystallized, and we realized these are really the difference makers for AI success in distributors. So that was a big surprise for me.
Other side of the coin, what did you not hear that surprised you?
I was surprised to not hear more about ethics and, some of the unintended consequences of AI as we're seeing them in popular press. Anyone who has a, backyard or dinner table conversation about AI today, those things seem to be front and center. And it didn't come up. And I don't think, Tom, as I process this, that is because people aren't thinking about those in distribution businesses today. I actually think there's sort of two things that are going on. So the first reason it's not happening is distribution as a sector, I think, is still very much in the relatively early days of adopting AI. And the implication there is that AI is being pointed at some of those early use cases right now that aren't yet that complicated or complex. And so some of those issues we think about or are talking about today as a society aren't necessarily present. But I do think that will change going forward. So I was a little surprised to not get more of that. But I think given the trajectory of AI in distribution, we're going to be having more of those conversations as an industry in the years ahead.
Kevin, what's the largest challenge that you see in the adoption of AI that you ran into in your research?
I think one of the biggest challenges in adoption, Tom, is it's actually a mindset thing. And it's related to the fact that so much of AI success, as we talked about at the opening, is not necessarily about the technology. What it ultimately comes down to is, can your AI application be put in place in a way that people love, people use, it gets adopted? And so it's actually the human factor of AI that I think is going to be the difference maker. I mean, we heard so many stories in the research of companies or even AI providers who in their earliest days built something that they thought was perfect. I'm talking perfect data, perfect models. The predictions, Tom, were world-changing. They're going to be amazing. And sure enough, they launch these things and roll out the AI, 2030 banner in the organization and hear nothing but crickets, either from the sales team or the ops team or the customers who are expected to use that thing. And what they found when they followed up, when they weren't getting the results they wanted and people weren't using this thing, is that they actually massively overlooked and underestimated how critical it is for this thing to be seen as easy to use, as helpful to my job and not hurtful to my job, as helping me get ahead in my own career, as actually solving a job for a customer that customer wants to be solved. And so I think if there's a challenge to get out ahead of for a distributor, It's actually not making sure that you have better technologists on the team, because I think that is going to be solved for in a lot of the vendors and a lot of the new skills that are being developed just en masse. But it's actually understanding what people want and need to be more successful in their jobs or as customers or as suppliers, et cetera. So that human factor, if I could bet on one thing, that would be the big challenge that we need to overcome as a sector to make AI work for us faster and better.
You and I had many conversations during this project with distributors and our research sponsors, which you've been highlighting in our conversation today. I wanted to bring in some of their comments into the mix. We asked Jimmy Dickinson of NTT Data what he thought the biggest challenges were, and here's what he had to say.
If you asked me 2 years ago, what I would say the challenge for AI and distribution was people couldn't think of use cases that make sense to do right now. The industry now has a dozen different applications or more, ranging from cross-selling and transportation optimization to chatbots to customer service. Now the trick is how to start faster and effectively and create a platform for success.
And Paul Noble of Verison also had some thoughts on this.
It always goes back to me, and this is just maybe, my personal belief on a lot of things, whether it's being an entrepreneur or trying to adopt a new technology, is just like start the conversation, start small, win big, start and fail potentially and adjust, right? Iterate and trust yourself and really dive in. It seems kind of like flowery and motivational, but it really is, can't overthink it. You don't want to overanalyze it too much. And again, ask the right questions, but start asking them.
And Kevin, following up on Paul's comments, what were some of the biggest takeaways from the many interviews that you conducted?
I would say look at the biggest, meatiest, thorniest, most persistent strategic issues that you're facing as a company, and then ask the question, well, what would happen if we pointed AI at that? And I think what that is going to do is for your specific strategy, your specific business, assuming that you've got great strategic choices already in place, you've got a clear roadmap of what you want to do, that's going to make sure that what you're doing with AI is adding value, is adding pace, is adding acceleration, and not distracting or detracting from the things you're trying to do as a company. And so I can't stress enough that you've got to look at strategy first. What are the big opportunity spaces you're trying to knock out? And then make AI work for you in going after those things.
I want to share here what Tony Pericles of Profit Optics had to say when we asked him for his advice around AI.
I think leaders need to understand and they need to experiment themselves. If they haven't got a ChatGPT account, they need to get a ChatGPT account. If they haven't downloaded a widget from one of the many add-ons to ChatGPT, go ahead and do it. If you haven't looked at, these note-taking software solutions that are AI driven, you need to experiment, because if you don't know the capabilities, you're not going to be able to match the needs with the capabilities. You're not going to be able to set that vision. If you understand the capabilities, then you can begin to set that vision.
Kevin, you ran into some myths and misunderstandings about implementing AI. What did that look like?
The biggest misconception, plain and simple, is we don't have enough data or good enough data to do AI. We're not worthy, Tom, because we don't have the stuff to feed AI. And there's a Canadian bank, Bank of Nova Scotia or Scotiabank, that has a motto that I think is a perfect analogy for this. And it's, you're richer than you think. That so perfectly applies to distributors and where they are with AI today. I mean, we heard this clearly from distributors and experts that we talked to. So one distributor that we talked to, they actually discovered this not in pursuing AI, but in announcing to their board they were going to implement a new ERP system. And a board member who happens to be really deeply experienced in digital transformation said, well, you should actually think about this as an opportunity to gather an audit or inventory of all the data across the company, ERP plus, and think about this as a data strategy, given what's coming with AI in the future. And then they thought, yeah, we're going to have a couple of sources of data, of course, ERP, some CRM stuff, et cetera. Well, they walked away from that inventory exercise, Tom. And by the way, this is one of the behaviors and building blocks that we found in the report. And they were blown away by the amount of data they had that they were just sitting on, but wasn't being used to drive insight or opportunity or customer experience, et cetera. So they were richer than they thought. And similarly, a lot of the vendors, providers, sponsors, experts we talk to, they have distributors come to them all the time. They want to get started with AI, but they're kind of ashamed to open the doors to the data room because it's kind of like when you haven't gone to the dentist in a while. They're like, holy smokes, I haven't really been flossing as much as I should have. And in almost every case, you find that distributors, for one, have nearly perfect ERP data because that's the backbone of the business. And for data sources that you don't have, the good news is those are increasingly available to distributors. So we're seeing much more customer collaboration, supplier collaboration, even access to non-traditional types of data like traffic data and Internet of Things data that, when combined with your existing in-house data as a distributor, can unlock all kinds of insights and potentially even new business models.
What's your biggest hope for AI and how it changes distribution in the next 5 years?
Well, I think my biggest hope stems from where I think distribution is applying AI today versus where I think, the real possibility is. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I think almost every use case that we uncovered in the research, so lots that distributors are working on today, that providers and vendors are helping distributors uncover. A lot of these, Tom, are about making the traditional distribution business as we know it today faster, cheaper, more efficient, with better customer experience. Those are all amazing things. We absolutely, hands down, should do that. Right now, those are novel differentiators. I think in the next few years, those are going to become just table stakes. And so that raises the question for me, where should and could AI go from there? If we get all this core business stuff solved, like what do we do next? And my hope is that we see distributors start to go on AI or innovation offense, if you will, to get out beyond this initial horizon of, tightening screws in the business and actually starting to imagine new business models, new profit models, new ways of capturing and creating value.
In your interview with Tony Pericles of Profit Optics, he made the point that he believes that the distributor of tomorrow will not be selling product as their primary source of income. It may still be their primary source of revenue, but their primary source of profit will be data. And when you look at margin compression and product commoditization, and you connect that with how AI can empower distributors in their sweet spots, it starts to get pretty interesting.
Tony talked about the potential for a distributor in the future to ultimately become almost a service provider of uptime for HVAC contractors, homeowner clients, right? Because if you think about smart thermostats and all the smart devices, water tanks, furnaces, heat pumps going into homes today, that data, if relayed into my HVAC parts distribution business, could become really powerful to getting out ahead of what the customer needs. And if we can do that, we can actually create new business models that don't exist today for distributors. That's really exciting. And so I'm hoping that this actually becomes a bit of an instigator or provocation springboard for distributors to reimagine some of the most very basic building blocks of their businesses.
This is a good place to bring in the comments of Ben Cohen of Proton.ai on his hopes and fears for AI.
We're really focused on the sales side of things. My biggest hope is that AI helps distributors stay really competitive by being able to deliver better than anyone else an experience for their customers. So it's really like an enabler for them to be able to compete with marketplaces and other sort of digital entrants. And so my big hope is that distributors are able to leverage the technology to deliver a better experience for their customers and ultimately be able to better compete with new entrants. My biggest fear is that we as an industry miss this opportunity to deliver a better experience and someone else figures out how to get between us and our customers because we don't figure it out.
Kevin, what's your fear around AI that you came away with from your research?
I think I have two big fears, Tom. So I think the first one is that we don't do what we just talked about. And so, we continue to be cautious and hesitant of AI. And the big shame in that, I think the big thing to be scared of there is that we actually don't end up unleashing human potential in companies, in employees, in people's careers as much as we could. That was a big theme that came through the research as well. There is no one we talked to who said that this is about job displacement. This is actually about helping people work on higher value, more strategic, more creative things. In fact, 1/3 of managers surveyed by Harvard Business Review, we included this in the research, identify creative thinking and judgment skills as their biggest development area in the future as AI takes over more administrative things. We should be loving the fact that that becomes the case, but also fearing that we don't make that possible for our people. And then I think the second fear I would have is that we don't confront some of the thorny, scary, ethical and unintended consequence things that we need to talk about, not only just in distribution, but as a society with AI. So lots of examples out there of generative AI becoming helpful for distributors and actually authoring, distributing, and running the RFP process for new suppliers. Well, if that becomes driven by AI, that raises all kinds of questions for us about how are those invitations being written? How is AI deciding who they get distributed to? How are we selecting? And I think in a world where we're seeing lots of we're seeing a next generation of leadership coming into distribution businesses, both through sale and succession and just changing demographics. We're also increasingly seeing more emphasis and care for things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so if AI is selecting our next suppliers, we ought to be looking at that with scrutiny. And so one of the building blocks, for example, in the report talks about encouraging leaders to confront and deliberate and raise those ethical issues early, because I believe that will actually be part of the key to solving AI for your business going forward.
The AI capabilities are really going to, I think, allow distributors to increase the value of their differentiation in terms of the services they provide, those personal relationships, the integrity, the validation of all those things in terms of the capabilities of distributor to be reliable supply chain partners. I don't think anybody's really talked about that or seen that because there's been so much smoke and mirrors that aren't getting at that. There has been this real focus on the bots are going to replace us and it's going to become a Borg world going forward.
Everybody that we talk to, Tom, I'm so glad you raised this. It absolutely does not see the Skynet version of the future, does not see the jobs going away. And in fact, they are focused for the most part on the opportunity to reimagine the customer relationship, to reimagine how they work with suppliers and even peer organizations. I had one distributor say to me that, the most basic way to describe a distribution business model is search, find, buy. It's like that's basically the three functions that we make possible for a customer today. But his point was that as AI becomes more pervasive through the industry, we can actually challenge the orthodoxy that that's all that a distribution business can do. And so we can actually think about finding the customer and presenting them with an option before they even realized that they faced that problem or needed that thing. We can anticipate needs and actually ship that product before they've asked for it. There are all kinds of use cases we're seeing that one use case at a time don't seem that transformational, but when you start to elegantly integrate these things, you all of a sudden look at them and go, holy smokes, this could really change things. And I think that's one of the things to pay attention to. So many of the leaders we talk to are spending dedicated time looking for those use cases, not only in distribution, but beyond. So lots of people referencing, for example, direct-to-consumer companies to find the possibilities and bring them home into their distribution business because they are quite excited about what's possible. So there is an overall feeling, I think, of optimism. And I think what we need to do is maintain that optimism with a healthy degree of skepticism and scrutiny to make sure that AI gets us to the future we all want.
I'm really glad you touched on that point. It triggered for me thinking about how many waves have we been through across this whole digital transformation that we've been in? Today, we take our phones so much for granted. They're an extension of us, right? And we don't think about it now, but how awkward initially and confusing and the barriers that a lot of people went through in terms of being able to adopt that and what that looks like.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do with that human factor too. Clay Shirky, who's a amazing professor of technology at NYU, has this famous quote that's something to the effect of, things don't get socially interesting until they become technologically boring. And in a lot of ways, I think ChatGPT did that for us because I wasn't having to lay lines of code. I wasn't having to read an instruction manual. The technology was invisible. It was very visible from the sense that it was amazing to us. We were getting these crazy responses to prompts that we were plugging in, but the technical parts kind of disappeared or started to fade into the background. Those are the things to pay attention to with emerging technology, because that really means that we're crossing a certain chasm in terms of human adoption. And I think we're starting to see that here in distribution.
Yeah, absolutely. If we were to write a sequel to this report in 3 to 5 years, what do you expect would change, and what would be the same?
That's a great question. If I think about the sort of future scenarios of AI for distributors, I think what we would see is that these behaviors and building blocks that we've surfaced through the research should actually be the same building blocks and behaviors that drive AI success going forward. The building blocks and those behaviors will stay the same. I think what will change is the complexity of AI applications that we're talking about. Certainly sophistication and maturity is going to be grown. If you take our assessment today and your average maturity is 3 out of 5 on those building blocks, you would hope that you're at a 4.5 a few years from now. And that means that you're scaling AI faster and easier. You're taking on more complicated and complex AI initiatives that are attacking the more thorny parts of your strategy. And I also think we will see a shift in where in the business model of distributors AI is being used as a result of those things. So the screw tightening, the efficiency finding, the reducing of manual work, all the stuff that's happening today with AI, which are the right first things to do, the low-hanging fruit, those are going to get tackled. And so the next horizon is the thing that I'm really eyes open to. Who's the first distributor, whether it's an existing distributor we know about today, or even a new entrant that really shakes things up because they're an AI-first distribution company. It's almost scary to think about that being a new entrant, because how would you start a distribution business today with AI without any of the baggage of a 50-year-old parts distributor behind you? That's a really interesting question. And if I was an ownership group or leadership group of a traditional incumbent distribution company today, I'd almost be actively trying to design that company and get out ahead of it before it happens to me. So I'm very curious to start to see some of these things click together and get us out into, Horizon 2 or Horizon 3 of where AI is taking us.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation and your session at our upcoming Shift conference here, September 18th to 20th. Kevin, thank you so much for the conversation and the great work on the research report. I know we're going to be adding to this ongoing in the future.
Well, thanks, Tom. I'm really excited to see the report get used, as well as the assessment parts of it, and for the real conversation happening at Shift, because those stories from those sponsors and experts are really the stories we want to get out there. So I'm looking forward to that.